Well, good day and welcome to an FS Club seminar. As you know, FS Club covers a whole variety of things, but principally areas of technology and finance. And today we're going to have a great discussion, I hope, with my dear friend Maury Schenk. And we're going to be talking about COVID-19 contact tracing. The subtext of this is a solution, a privacy and GDPR nightmare, or a technical bridge too far. And Maury and I have cooked up, we hope, a bit of a fun area for you. But today is an interesting day because today we saw that the UK government has launched 25,000 contact tracers. And we had apparently had 2,000 positive virus, 2013 positive virus things in the last week. And those tests are being traced down by an army of 25,000. And we'll come on to the distinction between the importance of contact tracing, but perhaps the dangers of using an app in a moment. Now, I'm Michael Mainelli. I am the executive chairman of Zien, and it's my privilege to be allowed to run these webinars, and I can only do that thanks to our many sponsors. And I have to thank our sponsors copiously, because what we love about them is that they give us a wide variety of latitude to cover the huge number of topics in technology and finance that matter to our club members. Anyway, today's outline is basically we're going to talk about permission frameworks, and Maury's going to cover the ground that he has written about at length and which was presented about 18 months ago. We're going to talk about contact tracing and why it might matter. Want to look at some of the efficacy concerns, I can say that. And we want to look at who's doing what and where. And then finally have a discussion about what this means for privacy and GDPR. So that's the outline. Maury's going to start. I'll pick up some of the stuff in the middle about what's going on actively. Maury is going to close on the privacy and GDPR concerns. That'll take about 25 minutes, we hope. And that leaves us about 20 minutes for questions. And this is an area where comments are as welcome as questions. Please do use the GoToWebinar question facility that you have on your app or screen to send questions through, and Maury and I will pick them up for you. Well, that's enough from me. My job is to get out of the way and let Maury introduce permission frameworks. Maury, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. You know, this webinar, as you know very well, started out with us thinking, well, we should represent our report on permission frameworks, and we realized the relevance to COVID-19 contact tracing, and that's why we're talking about that today. But let's talk about the broader framework. This is sort of a big, hairy, audacious idea that Michael and I came up with about 2 years ago, and that we wrote a report about 18 months ago. And the idea is that in today's digital environment, we really need a permission framework. And so what is a permission framework? It's a set of rules to say what can you do or what can't you do, what ought you to do, what ought you not to do in certain situations. And we don't have a consistent set of rules for that online. We do have it for access control, but there are all kinds of other circumstances. And there's a few pictures here on this first slide, you know, like getting access to a building, getting access to drive your Tesla Roadster. Hopefully many of you own one. Etc. And there are no widely accepted standards for this. There are tough cybersecurity issues. How do we develop a consistent framework for that? Next slide. So we're going to start with the answer. This is what we came up with, and it's a little bit technical. It's based on the Open Systems Interconnection Framework for networks, where you have a stack, and at the bottom is the underlying network. At the top is the services, where we have an idea of providing permission frameworks in a number of specific areas, such as privacy, which is what we're going to talk about today, consumer financial securities trading. And in the middle is the nuts and bolts, which I'll comment on to, which is a lot of what we wrote about something called Deontic Logic, which is obscure but kind of fun, and we'll talk some about that, and smart ledgers, what some people would call blockchain systems. We've done a lot of work together, and Michael's done a huge amount of work on smart ledgers and the roles that those could play in the solution. Next slide. So when choosing a permissions framework, there were a number of criteria we looked at. It needs to be precise enough to convey an exact permissions. It needs to be broad enough to convey any permission, and it needs to be usable, applicable in the real world. And so we looked at some candidates. Access control, as I mentioned, is pretty well developed. There are great permission frameworks for access to computer systems. Some of them are listed here, but it's pretty narrow and it's not easily extensible. There's something called differential privacy, which is originally, I believe Apple did a lot of work on this, and they continue to implement this in their systems and with the iPhone. It's conveying information while avoiding disclosure of personal information. And in the Apple Google protocol for contact tracing that Michael will talk about, they use that. And then there's something called Deontic Logic, which is the formal logic of what you may do and what you ought to do. And we thought Deontic Logic was a good candidate. Next slide. So what is Deontic Logic? Well, it's a little bit technical. When I presented this paper for the first time, I said Deontic Logic itself fails our usability criteria because look how technical it is. And I went through the examples. And people said to me afterwards, well, we could understand that. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly here, but the idea is you have some simple permission-based thing that a human uses, or simple or understandable, such as you are the authorized user of this computer system, which is there's a high level meaning of that, and some variables, and you write it as a deontic proposition. In this case, P meaning permission, that you have the right to access resource R. Going down to the bottom, a little more complicated. If you're at a nightclub, somebody says no ID, no entry. Well, that's a permission-based thing. You can dissect that to a high-level proposition. If a person can't prove that she's over age K, then she can't access research R, which is the hot nightclub. And on the right-hand side, we write that as a deontic proposition using some perhaps less familiar characters like the negation symbol and the something is provable from something simple. Next slide. In any event, to get there, to the permission framework that we said earlier, you need to somehow convert deontic logic into something that's understandable, which is why we developed the broader framework where there's a sector-specific level. Smart ledgers are also an important part of the solution. There are ways you could do this with a centralized solution that's not a distributed one like smart ledgers, but smart ledgers have some advantages. They're inherently distributed and permissions need to be inherently distributed. And open architectures, which is what we're trying to achieve with this framework, are very common. There are some technical challenges. It's complex, and dealing with complex things is not as advanced for smart ledgers as it is for centralized computer systems. And implementing deontic logic on a Boolean computer is challenging. And I won't go into the details of this. I'd be happy to talk about it offline or in questions, but the basic principle is the concept of may or the concept of ought is not completely congruent with the true false concept, the 0-1 of the bits of a Boolean computer. So in our presentation, in our paper that we wrote, we talked about legal challenges. GDPR challenges for implementing this kind of permissions framework. We looked at major jurisdictions, Europe, US, China, and India, and the challenges were quite different by the jurisdictions. And we talked about some of the tensions between GDPR and smart ledgers. The big ones are erasure, that it's hard to erase stuff that's on a smart ledger, and there's some rights to that under GDPR, and that repeated processing of the ledger is arguably inconsistent with data minimization principles under GDPR. But we think there are solutions to those. We wrote about them in a lot more detail in our report. Next slide. So this is our report. It's available on the ZN website, and there's a link here, which I believe this presentation will be available. And you can read in a lot more detail about what I've just talked about. But really, the agenda of the day is to apply this to COVID-19 contact tracing. And for details of some contact tracing solutions, I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thank you very much, Maury. It was a rapid run through a very deep and important paper, and I think the point that you've made, which is crucial here, is that had we had a permissioning structure that had been agreed prior to COVID-19, it would have been a lot simpler to think about some of the concepts underlying the tracing systems. But it's my job to talk about contact tracing and see that as an important part of the applicability of permissioning systems. So in contact tracing, as you can see on the slide before you, what you're really trying to do is to follow somebody who has actually exhibited either an exposure to the virus or symptoms of the virus, and you want to basically find out whom they've been in turn in contact with. And that's what the 25,000 people are doing today. They're looking at people, seeing who they've been in touch with, and following that up and trying to therefore counsel people on what the appropriate behavior is, which is largely isolation for the vast majority of people that they're attempting to contact. So a fairly straightforward application. But where might an app, as we call it, fit in? Well, the BBC has described it as follows, that the contact tracing app really just records details of those people who are near you. And if it turns out that one of those people has exhibited symptoms of the virus, then or tested positive for the virus, then you in turn will be contacted after the event. So nothing very complex here, you might think. But of course, the difficulty here is that the systems that are doing this potentially do, in many cases, violate GDPR. I put up a slide for one system that Zien has proposed, something called Cove ID. That is one approach. It is hardly alone, and I'm not here to sell that because I'm going to go through, in fact, some of the other larger systems that are out there. Well, the first thing is that in the Far East, which exhibited the virus early on, you can see here three different systems. You have the Korean system, you've got the Chinese system, and you also, in fact, have down here a German system. So people, sorry, Swiss German system. So you've got people out there who've already built contact tracing apps. And in many of these cases, these apps have been deployed in areas without our legal structure. And to some degree, therefore, the permissioning frameworks that we're talking about either haven't applied or have been overridden due to the emergency. And that is a local decision. Singapore's Trace Together is a pretty good example of an application out there. Trace Together it has been tracing on a smartphone app, but it actually only achieved about a 20-25% take up by the population. So we'll come on to the efficacy of some of these systems later. But what you'll see here is basically the Singaporean government saying, if you give us this data, then we will use it. However, in most of the Western world, part of our difficulty has been, have I given permission for you to use that? And what are you going to be using this data for? And there have been a host of protocols. So while Zien may have come up with Cove ID, as I said, we're hardly alone. And you'll find many others and potentially much more successful projects out there, consortium of various type. I'm going to focus, though, if I might, really on four. The three of them are what we think might be the leading consortia simply by weight of momentum. And the fourth is, of course, the NHS contact tracing protocol down at the bottom of this slide. And probably the most interesting thing about the NHS contact tracing protocol has been that it's been developed neither on the back of any of the existing Far Eastern systems that have sort of seen the hard edge of the pandemic, nor has it been developed using any of the consortia. And finally, it is a private specification as opposed to an open source specification, and one that relies upon central logging. And central logging is got particular dangers in a GDPR sense, merely because of the vulnerability of a centralized system and the fact that, of course, somebody does control it. And that's as opposed to some of the smart ledgers that Maury was talking about earlier. But the three that do feature, and for those of you who are not familiar with this area, one is what's called DP3T, Decentralized Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing. Try and say that 5 times fast, and you're going to be a better person than I. This project, which locally involves University College London, but is really spread across Europe, has received some pretty good, some very good responses. There are a few niggles about the security, but it is a GDPR compliant system. A second GDPR compliant system is pan-European privacy preserving proximity tracing. There seems to be something here about tongue twisters, that you can't have a successful consortium without a good tongue twister. And again, this one has had a little bit more press about it that's been slightly negative, again, about privacy concerns and security concerns, but is definitely up there. And finally, an interesting approach by Google and Apple, who've got their privacy preserving contact tracing project. There we go. I'm getting through these, Maury, I hope. uh, and this third project was an effort really by Google and Apple to work together so that the apps could function both on the iPhones and the Android system phones out there. This project, in fact, was notified to the UK Information Commission Office earlier this year, principally because there were potential anti-competitive violations of the two firms working together. It's been approved in many jurisdictions. It's okay if these two want to work together on this specific project. The Google and Apple proposal is here on this slide together. And again, fairly simple. When A and B meet, their phones exchange a code. If A becomes infected, he updates his status, and then there's consent to share with B that he has tested positive, and then she needs to take an appropriate reaction. This could or may not be available to contact tracers if they wish to feature in the system as well. So in the UK, the application looks very similar, as you can see here. This is from the BBC, and it basically shows a slide almost identical to the Google and Apple slide. But the principal difference here is that it's a centralized database as opposed to a distributed database and data structure. So that's a quick canter through a field that is moving very, very rapidly. And while I may have focused on 4 applications, the 3 consortia plus the NHS, there's no clue which one of these or the many others might turn out to be predominant if contact tracing using apps is something that we wish to pursue. I'm going to turn back to Maury because there are privacy and GDPR concerns that he would like to cover for you.
Thank you very much, Michael. So, yes, contact tracing apps really raise a host of concerns that are right at the heart of data protection law. In GDPR, there's a principle of data protection by design and default. You have to build privacy into the app, and privacy being so important, you absolutely have to think about that here. Processing for limited purposes and minimization, will come on to that, particularly with the question of centralized solutions versus decentralized solutions. And what is the basis for processing? Are you processing it because people have given you their consent? Or can you mandate it? There is a basis for processing in the public interest? Could you force people to have their data processed for this purpose? There's a lot of people who have looked at these privacy issues, but sitting here in what used to be part of the EU and still follows EU law for the time being, and will continue to apply GDPR here in the UK. The European Data Protection Board recommendations are probably the most influential guidance on this, in my opinion. And it's a fairly long set of guidance, 20 pages of comments on how to do this best, but I've tried to distill down the essence of it here. Basically, the board has said that contact tracing must be voluntary. You can't force people to carry an app that says who they've been in contact with. Interestingly, they favored national apps over third-party apps. So there are some people who have tried to go, some private companies that have tried to introduce contact tracing, whether as a business or otherwise. And I think the board basically just saw risk from that the data will be misused, that it will be a smokescreen for some other use of people's location data. And also to get a large uptake, you really do need a national app. The board has also said that you shouldn't have general sharing of location data. Although coming to the last bullet, they've said that either centralized or decentralized solutions are acceptable. The real issue with the centralized solution is that you have to pass everybody's location data to the solution, and it can be architected in a way that it should only be usable for contact tracing, but that's only if you trust the party that's doing it. And there's a lot of central government authorities that would love to have the surveillance data of knowing where a large percentage of the population is going all the time. That's very controversial from a privacy perspective. And so that tension between location and centralized or decentralized solutions is really at the heart of it. But there are ways to do both in a privacy compliant way, says the European Data Protection Board at least. Final point that they've said is that when identifying an individual as infected under any solution, it should only be after a proper health assessment. No arbitrary saying that somebody has COVID-19, and that they should be identified pseudonymously. So not anonymously, they can be re-identified, but it shouldn't be with their name. So the question here is, should the law bend to the exigencies of this situation, which seem a little bit less severe now than they did a few weeks ago? But I think most of us, a lot of technically sophisticated people think we've got a long way to go with this, with the COVID-19 problem. And so, how much you bend the law for app-driven contact tracing, I think depends upon the question of efficacy. And there's contact tracing, as Michael introduced this seminar by saying there's 25,000 people going out starting today to trace contacts in the UK, starting with only 2,000 people who were identified as positive last week. I don't know whether all 25,000 are needed for just 2,000 positive tests, but the point is it's very hard to do. But there is a consensus that that kind of people-intensive contact tracing is effective. It's been demonstrated repeatedly. It's been demonstrated in the Ebola outbreak in Africa. But app-driven contact tracing is completely unproved, and there are reasons to believe that it wouldn't work as well yet as people-driven. Here we summarize some of the efficacy concerns. There's the risk of false positives. You don't know how far away the Bluetooth communications were. People could actually be quite close together, but be on the other side of a wall. So there's actually no risk. And GPS and Bluetooth have some inherent inaccuracies in them. That's also a problem with false negatives, where people have been close together, but the app doesn't pick it up. And probably the biggest problem is that, assuming this is voluntary, that people have to download the app. You need a very big uptake. It's estimated around 70+% to make this useful at all. And even in Singapore, which was a bit of a poster child for this, as Michael said, they didn't get much more than 20% uptake. And Iceland did app-driven contact tracing and has been very successful suppressing the virus, but recently the law enforcement there has commented that the apps really didn't play much of a role in that. And there's other problems such as the transmission time, and so, and even if you use it, are you going to respond to a suggestion that you need to quarantine with all these risks? If somebody sends you a message that says you may have been near somebody who had COVID-19, are you really sure that you're going to quarantine for 2 weeks on that basis? And there's a few other issues regarding the technical performance of the phone. Bluetooth constantly working in the background that's going to run down batteries, which none of us really like. And so with everybody feeling that the risk from the virus is probably a little bit less severe, we're starting to open up. Are we going to get 70% of people to download it? I'm extremely skeptical of that. And so the GDPR concerns are there, but I actually think the efficacy concerns are more fundamental. Michael mentioned the ZN COVID concern, which is it's contact tracing, but it's closer to a passport approach that is being used in China, where people carry around an app that says whether they are safe for COVID-19, whether they're sick now, whether they've had the disease. I think things like that may be a more important element of the solution that allows people to move around than app-driven contact tracing. So with that, I'll turn it back to Michael to be the MC of questions.
Well, Maury, we've got 60 people online, and so there are actually a lot of questions. But I think I just kind of sum up that this last bit about permission frameworks, we've seen effectively, your paper from 18 months ago saying this is an important framework to get right. We've now had an application tracing, and then as you just ended and pointing out, we're going to move into areas like documentation and others, which all are different but require a framework in which you can put these without constantly having people throwing up red flags about the event. And we're going to wander, I can see from some of the questions here, a little bit into the areas which will be pushing our boundaries of knowledge, let alone any any element of authority about the disease itself and best treatment. But let's get started here. Well, the first comment is really more a comment from Robert Woodthorpe Brown, and he was pointing out that listening to Taiwanese Tech Minister Audrey Tang, she emphasized that the Taiwanese government bent over backwards to involve the public by telling the whole truth every day. They obtained the full consent of the people, hence their success. They learned of the outbreak in Wuhan, believe it or not, on the 31st of December last year, and started testing arrivals the following day, the 1st of January. So, well and above contact tracing, and the Taiwanese experience is salutary. It is very much early response and effective response. So thank you very much for that comment, Bob. Maury, we've got a question here about, is it time really for a formal national review of GDPR in light of the expansion of technology developments and its new reach into the domain of privacy? Is that really required, or do you think that the framework sort of discussions that you've had could be implemented without some big royal commission?
Well, the GDPR has a built-in review process from 2 years out, which we're approaching, and people are going to start to look at that. There are problems with GDPR. My own personal bugbear is some of the obligations on data processors, where there's this horrible proliferation of data processing agreements. So I think there are some things that need to be reviewed, but it's early days. We're just not that far in. There hasn't been that much enforcement. So my view would be it's early for a wholesale review, and that we need to tinker at the edges. I did have one comment on the first comment about Taiwan, on Sweden, and the point that was made about trust. The Swedes have been held up by the likes of certain, orange-faced presidents of as an example of how you can be open, not locked down and still have a successful response to COVID-19. And I think the point was made in Sweden that they had a highly trust-based society, so that when people are trusted to behave, as I think the point was made about Taiwan, the response can work better. And so I thought that was a very interesting point.
Maury, interesting to hear Bob McDowell, who's dialing in from the Channel Islands, has got a couple of comments here, and I'd sum it up as he's asking really, why not set permissioning with sunset clauses to compel formal revision in the future? Any thoughts on, couldn't this be achieved simply with just government saying, well, there's a sunset clause, we're going to destroy all the data in 60 days or something?
Well, Bob is a dear friend, so hi, Bob. Good question. Yes, I think that people would like to do exactly that. The problem is, will they? I was just reading an article yesterday, I think, and I'm forgetting the country, but I think it might have been, I think it was China, where these things are being rolled out for COVID-19 and are being, even though China has its COVID-19 situation much under control, although there continue to be small outbreaks and heavy control of society to prevent that from getting worse. But situations under control, but the apps seem to be durable. Some of the additional features are durable, and China is famous through social credit and starting to introduce greater surveillance of society. I think we might fear the same thing happening in what we like to think of as our freer societies, because surveillance is sort of an ever rising tide here. So yes, it would be good if we could do that. Will it happen? We've got to be careful.
Ricardo Tasato is asking something. I'm going to throw it at you, but I would point out to most viewers that this is something you may need to get your head around and actually read online. It's a question about privacy. If the tracing apps acquire information in a really anonymous manner, how can I be contacted if a person I met days ago is found to have been infected? So he's quite curious here about how is this anonymous? If you don't mind, maybe just 30 seconds on that, Maury, because I know it can get technical fast.
All right. Well, so let's talk about the Google Apple protocol, which is probably the most widespread one. And Google and Apple have been really robust in saying they will only enable a protocol on their phones that's local to the phone, and they will not allow a centralized solution where the information goes to a centralized server. And taking such a local solution, all that the phone knows is that it's been near other phones over a period of time that send out signals, and if at some point the system declares that one of those phones was owned by a person who later became known to be COVID-19 positive, your phone will know that, but nobody else will know that. And the person who's COVID-19 positive has to record it on their own phone. So it really is, there is no way that information can leak about who's positive and who is not under that system.
Good, thank you. Liz Thrussell makes an interesting point. People with apps are more likely to be in circulation than people without smartphones who have tended to stay at home. Surely tracing is better than nothing. If the R rate stays at 0.5, it will take us 16 months to overcome. You want to make any remarks on that point?
That's a really interesting point. I mean, yeah. maybe if maybe the number isn't as high as 70% of the total population that I cited and that I had read. If that, assuming that if you can get a large proportion, a majority of people who are actually moving about to download these apps, it could be better than nothing. Although I'll say again, in Iceland, where they had pretty good uptake of this, they said, well, it helped a little bit. So the question is, how much resources do we throw at this versus other things, I think.
Lud Zrowski is returning a little bit to a distinction. In fact, I may not have been quite as clear as you were, Maury, that we've got contact tracing, and then we have kind of identity. We have health documentation and identity issues as well. So they're two different potential applications already in this sphere. And one of the problems with the second one on identification is we're still unsure at a scientific level whether or not exposure or recovery from the virus actually gives you any long-term immunity. But leaving that to one side, his point here was, given efficacy concerns of track and trace, wouldn't it be better to focus on voluntary and interoperable travel health status credentials, for example, something to allow people to travel between the UK and Singapore? And what are your thoughts on people who are working on this type of interoperability?
Well, I might throw part of that back to you, Michael, with the COVID solution. But as I said, I think that those kind of credentials are a more likely part of our durable solution than app-driven contact tracing. I think there was the question just had, isn't something better than nothing? And yes, but a place to focus our resources, we need to get our societies running in a way that can survive long-term presence of coronavirus with minimal human cost. And the things that are likely to make that possible are things like widespread testing, knowing what people's status is, and wearing masks. Originally, none of us wanted to wear a mask because we know it doesn't do much to prevent coronavirus um, in the person wearing the mask. But what it does is it prevents the person who has coronavirus who is wearing the mask from spreading it. And that seems to be fairly clear from the experience in South Korea. So those kind of practical solutions, I think, are what's going to get us all back up and running.
Yeah, it's interesting. This whole idea of kind of placebo gestures, whether it's pressing the button at a crosswalk and it doesn't do anything, but it makes you feel better, uh, matter. And for a long time here, we've been sort of claiming effectively that face masks were placebo, and now it turns out that maybe they do actually they do aid in preventing spread, which I would have thought was a good reason, and yet our government seems to not care about having face masks. On the other hand, do you think that these apps are sort of placebo apps in a way, the contact tracing apps?
It's They might be. The efficacy slide there, and we had a link on there, was drawn from largely from Bruce Schneier, who is my favorite information security commentator. And Schneier likes talking about what he calls security theater. The screening at the airports, which makes us all feel more secure, but a lot of it isn't really directed at the biggest threats. You could say that that there is a bit of health theater in these things. I think that our government in the UK is flailing a little bit in its response. It's done a good job on the economic response to COVID-19, a less good job on the public health response, and might be grabbing at these apps as showing that something is being done. I do think that the army of NHS tracers that was announced today that you mentioned is a positive step.
Yeah, it's a positive step, and it's known and it works, and it's the sort of thing that we arguably should have been doing at the time that Taiwan began, which was on New Year's Eve. So there we
Right.
are. Um, Roger James isn't taking this lying down, and I like this. The summary is rather absolutist, whether an app by itself can work. What about an and strategy integrated with manual tracking, where the app augments tracing? Most of the damage is done at the step of contacting a potentially infected individual, not the app. So is GDPR therefore a sideshow and a wider challenge?
Well, it's a good challenge, and I think a lot of the questions are around this point. I mean, how could the app? There was the earlier comment. Is an app better than nothing? I think it's a really good challenge to say an and thing. I mean, what our innovative people in our society are good at is figuring out clever ways to deal with challenges. And so we have tremendous resources going into vaccines for COVID-19 and talking about having a vaccine ready faster than a vaccine has ever been ready before, under half the time. I think you could probably figure out ways to better combine an app with other bits of contact tracing. The proponents of a centralized solution would say that if you can put this information of who's infected and who's been close together in the hands of health authorities, then they can use it to supplement the human contact tracing. And I think that's probably right. And so, in the faces of this crisis, should we put a more powerful centralized solution in the hands of health authorities and use it as part of the solution? I think is a real question. It would have some serious privacy implications, but I certainly think the argument that it's a thing to do is defensible.
Your last comment there touches on something that somebody else Ian Harris, wanted to point out. The current crisis regulations are an extreme imposition on our civil liberties. I'm not convinced that mandatory use of GPS data for track and trace is a greater imposition. I worry more about efficacy of contact track and trace, both machine informed and old fashioned detective work. Your thoughts?
Well, I agree. I usually agree with things that Ian has to say. I mean, I think that in tough times, you need tough measures. And a lot of people have made the comments about the human cost of shutdown itself, the economic cost being massive. And so to avoid other restraints on our liberties and damage to health, we probably have to accept some limitations on privacy. Um, People would argue on the other side that um, the tough times sometimes begets bad law. So we had earlier situations where European data retention rules, where law and telecoms carriers were required to retain data on all communications, came into the force as a result of bombings. I think it was the bombings in Madrid that led to those. And responding to terrorism is certainly a legitimate concern, but there's been a big fight of, did that go too far? And I think this comes down to Bob McDowell's comment. Can we implement this in a way that abridges our privacy for some time and then destroy the data and not let it be a camel's nose under the tent for broadening of the surveillance state? This is where the debate is. It's a hard debate. I agree with. I don't have a disagreement with any of the points that have been made.
Yeah, good. Um, uh, we're going to have to close on questions a minute because I also want to pull us back to finish on permission frameworks. But I'll just slip in here. Michael Cooper, who knows a heck of a lot about technology, I know, is curious about what about models that simply use location tracking, time data, and analysis, which mobile operators already have, either through things like QR codes, mobile location detection, etc., as opposed to Bluetooth and proximity handshakes. But we're not here to redesign that. But I think those would all equally have GDPR issues if they identified an individual, but he might have a few thoughts on other ways that could be architected to make a terrible verb there. One of the things I just wanted to finish on, Maury, though, was actually the paper that did come out 18 months back. Imagine that back that November 2018, that this paper had taken the world by storm, and the UK government had said, "This is fantastic. We can see that by inserting this layer in the OSI system, where we're actually tracking things, we would be able to record all the logics and permissions that had been given to people, and therefore Deontic Logic would be a decent structure for it, and they'd implemented it." How would that have affected the interest in developing contact tracing from January of this year?
Well, I'll say, first of all, our paper should have taken the world by storm. Maybe it took a small segment of the world by storm, but even if it had done, I don't think 18 months would have been long enough to get it into networks. But if starting to talk about these things um, would forward the conversation about a lot of the issues that Google and Apple are confronting. Um, Combining the Android and iOS platforms in a way that allows these permissions to happen seamlessly for everybody. Those kind of discussions would be easier if we had a broad society-wide framework like we do for the internet. Like everybody knows how you communicate on the internet. Everybody knows how you send an email. Everybody, if you could say everybody knows how you ask for permission for something, it would make these kind of discussions a little bit more liquid. And I think it will. I think this discussion around contact tracing has moved this forward to a certain extent. That Google, there is now a precedent for Google and Apple to work together to get 99% of the world's smartphones and allow this kind of permission to happen. And maybe it will lead to something more general.
Yes, I think, in my personal terms, in the sense of an outlook view from me, I'd agree with you. I think the never waste a good crisis, and the paper came out when the paper came out, but this type of work indicates the importance of having some of that groundwork thinking in place. And more importantly, the idea behind the permission frameworks was the Deontic logic was a way of recording all of that and then using these smart ledgers to do that type of recording so that we can keep GDPR and things under control and meet the requirements that we all want in society. I think the thing that bothers me is this idea that the minute we hit a crisis, we've got to understand we've got to solve the crisis. Well, fine, but what are we doing to make sure that in subsequent crises we can actually apply sensible principles at all time, rather than throwing sensible principles out every time there's a crisis? So I think that's a good point. Just before I close, anything you want to comment on, Maury, before we finish?
No, I think that was an excellent close, Michael. I love having conversations that are both intellectual and practical, and nobody's better at enabling that than you are. So thank you very much for inviting me to do so on this COVID-19 topic.
Yeah, when I next see you in person, I'll buy you a drink for saying that. Thank you very much, Maury. Anyway, folks, before we close, I absolutely must thank our sponsors as I opened. It is really their forbearance and their tolerance that allows us to range so widely across, as Maury says, the intellectual and the practical. But Maury, it falls to me, I think, to thank you on behalf of the audience. And I'm afraid in these days where you're unable to see your audience, I'm going to give you a virtual clap and say thanks so much for appearing today and putting some hard thinking into a very topical subject on exactly the day when it's probably most topical of all. So thank you so much, and look forward to having you again. I believe you're speaking to us next month on quantum computing, which should be really, really fascinating, an area I know you know a lot about. So I'm looking forward to that as well. Take care, all.